The scripture reading this morning is a familiar Psalm 46. So listen to these words of the psalm. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose stream makes glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in uproar. The kingdoms totter. He utters his voice. The earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, and see what desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes the wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge.
All right, here we go. And for those of you who have not been with us before on one of these Sundays, instead of a message, I will spend the time answering as many of your biblical and theological and spiritual and even personal questions as time allows. And the procedure is that we have had a number of questions sent in beforehand, that you always have that option, or just come with them. We will start with one of the ones that's been sent in ahead of time to sort of prime the pump, and then we go back and forth. These to you, these to you, these to you. So, here we go. How did God come to be? Does saying God is the Alpha and Omega mean that God was first in existence and will be last? Always good to start with an easy one. All right, I need to read this again. Okay. All right. I am not a physicist, so I cannot speak to how physicists understand that kind of thing. There are many good resources out there if you are looking for someone who understands physics and has sort of tried to tie that into theology. I can only speak from sort of a biblical and theological perspective. The idea, the expression that God is the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. Okay, and the question, how did God come to be? They are related ideas. Okay, so the understanding in both Jewish and Christian theology is that God exists outside of time and space. Okay, the idea, the understanding is that God always was, is, and always will be. Okay, and that theological understanding comes from the idea in, again, Judaism and Christianity, that God is spirit. Okay? We get caught up sometimes in our anthropomorphizing God. The he pronouns in the Bible, and trying to describe God in human terms. It's a very understandable thing that we do because it helps us make sense of who and what God is. But at the same time, it can be a detraction, I think, from our theological understandings and our way of worshiping God, in that we get too hung up on those kinds of human representations and lose the fact that, again, from the beginnings of Judaism and Christianity, God was understood as spirit. Okay? And as spirit, God can exist outside of time and space, which would mean that God can and is the Alpha and the Omega, existed before and will exist after anything else. Okay, and that sort of, again, is also the answer to the first question: how did God come to be? The understanding is that God always was, because God is spirit, and spirit has always existed. Right? That's a biblical and theological understanding. Okay. Your turn. Yeah, you just happen to show up on this Sunday, right? Okay.
The first verse in Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The question in my mind, we all, as we get older, and before we get older, we are facing crises. The most significant and troublesome are health crises, health issues.
Yeah.
Are those that have a faith in God and Christ, are the faithful more likely able to cope with this crisis or with the adversity? And second, is there evidence that the faithfulness would result in better coping and quicker healing?
Okay. All right. So Marcel's question relates to the beginning of the psalm that Paul just shared with us. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. And Marcel asks about the fact that we always face struggles, and certainly as we get older, there are additional struggles, more health-related concerns, things of that nature. And so the question was, do those who are centered in a faith life or part of a faith community, a faith tradition, are they able to cope with those things better? Is that a good synopsis of the? Okay. And do they heal faster? Okay. Okay. So in terms of the second part, do they heal faster? The evidence is less clear. Okay. There are some studies that have suggested that, in fact, those of us who are part of a faith community do heal faster, heal better. Others kind of dispute that. And again, as you know, science is not necessarily value-free. Research is not value-free. There is a tendency, researchers who are part of a faith community tend to find that it is more helpful, and those who are not tend to find that perhaps it's not any more helpful. As for the first one, do they cope better? That evidence is much clearer, that those who are part of a religious tradition who are deeply spiritual are, in fact, able to cope with the struggles that come in life better than those who don't. That research has been much more consistent and clearer over the years. All right. Okay. A couple of weeks ago, you mentioned the importance of understanding the original context of the Ten Commandments. Can you give a couple of specific examples of what you meant? Okay. Yeah, I was talking about the Ten Commandments, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were talking at that time about Moses presenting the second set of 10 commandments. Again, quick review. 2 sets of 10 commandments. The first set he smashed to the ground because when he came down from Mount Sinai with them, he found that the Israelites were worshiping the golden calf. Got mad, threw them on the ground. Goes back up, gets another set, brings those back down. So there's a scene in Exodus where he's talking, Exodus, Deuteronomy, I can't remember which passage I was looking at, a scene where he is recapping that with the Israelites. And then after that, he sort of summarizes the heart of them. Okay? And on that Sunday, we kind of talked about the fact that, you know, we need to remember the context those were written in and what's at the heart of them. The contextual part, again, they were written in a specific time and place for a specific community. Yes, there is universal application in many ways, but we also can't lose sight of their connection to important themes of the time and important themes in the Bible, particularly justice. Okay, and I'll give you two examples of the original context of those commandments. One, the fifth commandment: honor your father and your mother. Okay, in modern, Western civilization, I don't know what it was like when you grew up, but that one was always presented to us as, don't talk back to your parents, that kind of thing. But in the original context, the fifth commandment, to honor your father and mother, had a much more economic context to it. The idea was you were to honor your father and mother by making sure that they were cared for economically and materially in their old age or in times of illness. Okay? So that was rooted in a particular economic concern. And then there's the ninth commandment: you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, which often gets shortened, again, the way it was presented to me as a kid: don't lie. Okay? Good, that's good. But in the specific context that the commandment was written in, it had to do with justice issues. Okay? In Jewish law, there needed to be 2 eyewitnesses to a purported offense. If someone had been accused of something, there needed to be 2 eyewitnesses to verify that indeed had happened for a person to be found guilty. That commandment relates to the idea of essentially not perjuring yourself, being truthful when it came to matters of justice. Okay? So that's what I meant by us not losing track of the original context that the commandments were written in and how those still apply in that way now. Okay? All right, your turn. Frank? Yeah. Okay. So as Frank pointed out, the 10 Commandments they're essentially divided into 2 segments. They come as a whole, but the first 3, I think it's the first 3, are about our relationship with God, and the last 7 are about our relationship with other people. Okay? 2 things there. The first thing is that they are in the order they are in because the understanding is that God comes first. So that's why the ones pertaining to God are listed first. The other understanding is that everything else that follows, our way of being with each other, which the other 7 address, is rooted in our understanding of the first 3. Okay, for instance, the idea of having no other gods before God. Okay? There's a reason that that's first. Okay? In my mind, it is the most important commandment of all because so much of the troubles that we have in terms of how we interact with each other and how we treat others is rooted in our having other gods before the one God. Whether that God is wealth or power or fame or prestige, whatever it is, our offenses against each other are almost always rooted in some way to having another God come before the one God. Okay? So there's those factors involved. And then, of course, for the Israelite community who had these commandments first, it was also a reminder that our worship of God and our being faithful people of God cannot be separated from our interactions with others. Okay, we've talked about this a number of times, either in Bible study or Tuesday nights or even on Sundays. The idea that the Bible is not about just our individual salvation or our individual morals and ethics. It's not. It is, but it's not just about that. The theme that runs throughout the biblical literature is that can never be separated from the community. Okay? That we are called by God individually, and we'll say it again during communion in a little while. We are called by God individually and called by God as a community, and those can never be separated. So all of those things come into play in terms of why they're structured that way. Okay? All right. How do you feel about the recent IRS guideline that allows clergy to endorse political candidates? No, thank you. Yeah, that refers to something called the Johnson Amendment that was put into place during Lyndon Johnson's administration. It had to do with tax-exempt status for churches. That in order to have tax-exempt status, a church or its clergy could not, from the pulpit, endorse particular political candidates or parties in specific ways. Okay? So now the IRS is proposing that go away. Okay? Two things. One is that in all practical purposes, in many churches it already went away, because there are a number of churches who have basically ignored the Johnson Amendment and basically said, we're going to endorse political candidates, you do what you want. And there's been very little enforcement, almost none, of the Johnson Amendment. Okay? So my own personal feeling is that you will never hear me endorse a political candidate from this place. Not going to happen. Okay? I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good for us politically, and I don't think it's good for us in terms of our faith, in terms of our religious life together. The concern originally with the Johnson Amendment was the concern of having churches get involved in partisan politics. Okay? And yes, that's a concern, but I don't think it's the only concern, because to me the other concern in getting rid of the Johnson Amendment is that it opens the door for government to coerce churches, to pressure churches to take particular political stances or endorse particular political candidates. And you could say, well, yeah, but you talk about things that are considered political all the time, and that is very true. But I do it from a biblical and theological and spiritual perspective, and also from the understanding of the term political the way the ancient Greeks understood it, meaning the body politic, or to put that a different way, the common good. So that's a different thing. Okay, we do that all the time, and I think we're called to do that kind of thing. But in terms of endorsing particular political candidates, no, because again, I don't think it's good for the country politically, but my greater concern is I don't think it's good for us because of the possibility of government coercion into what we say and don't say. Your turn. Marcel again.
Throughout history, man has been in search of a creator,
Uh-huh.
a higher power. So they made a creator of whatever was available to them. Stone, even fruit, trees, whatever, until monotheism came into being.
Mm-hmm.
God. God is an idea in many ways. There is a cosmological, theological, philosophical evidence. And philosophers have struggled throughout history with that. And finally, one of these philosophers suggests decide whether he is there or he is not there. In fact, it's an idea, it's a need, it's a desire that has been in man's mind throughout history. The fact that it has been there, it must be true.
Okay.
And I wonder what your thoughts are.
Okay. I'm going to have to condense that a bit, though. So Marcel's asking about the idea that from the beginning of our existence, we have looked to have some concept of a creator, of God throughout humanity. And oftentimes that's been a tangible thing. Again, the golden calf, that kind of thing. But that idea has persisted in us throughout our history. What do I think of that, and does that mean that God is real? Well, yeah, my understanding is that God is very much real. But for something to be real doesn't mean that it has to be tangible. We talked about just a second ago the idea, the understanding that God is spirit. Right? And so my sense is that we have had that urge, that draw to try to understand who and what God is, throughout our existence, because that inclination is a part of us. I think it's innately in us to try to understand those things and to try to connect with that spirit. Okay? And again, cultures throughout history have expressed that, represented it in many different ways, until, as you pointed out, the emergence of monotheism in the ancient Jewish community, the ancient Israelites. Okay? They were the first, according to most scholars, to move from that tangible representation to an intangible one, the understanding of God as spirit. But again, it doesn't, just because God is spirit doesn't mean that God isn't real. To me, those two things are not in conflict with each other. God is very much real to me, and I'm sure probably to you, or you wouldn't be here. So that's my general take on that.
If we do not know what he is, when you say he is a spirit, I'm not sure what that means.
Right, and we recognize that in Jewish and Christian theology. We recognize that, the fact that God is spirit at the same time means that we cannot ultimately know God. I'm glad, thank you for bringing that up, because I did not get to that part of your question. God is ultimately unknowable, completely unknowable. It doesn't mean that we can't know, as in understand certain aspects of how God calls us to live. We talked about this a couple weeks ago with patterns, and the new Tuesday night class that's going to start a week from this Tuesday is about that, the patterns in the Bible, because you can find at least one thing in the Bible to support pretty much any position you want on just about anything. So the question for me always is, what are the patterns? Because I think the patterns are the things that suggest to us the things that we can know most clearly, if not completely, about God. And those patterns throughout the Bible are God's calls for justice, for care of creation, for care for the most vulnerable in society, those kinds of things. Those run start to finish. There's a lot of other things that don't. So no, ultimately, Christian and Jewish theology recognizes we cannot ultimately know God, but that doesn't mean that we can't know things or understand things about God. All right. The uncle of a friend died in his sleep recently. He denied the existence of God. We want him to go to heaven. Will our prayers get him there? This is where I rely on the UCC standard statement, I don't know. I don't know. Okay? I would like to believe that is true, because I believe in a God of grace, okay? And grace is understood theologically as God's unmerited favor and blessing. Okay? It means that there is nothing we can do to deserve it or earn it. It is just freely given to us by God. So, according to God's grace, I mean, that is certainly possible, but I don't know. I don't know. And in terms of prayer, that gets us into the issue of prayer. What is prayer for? Well, one of the things that prayer is for is to intercede on behalf of someone. Okay? And there are stories in the biblical literature in which the intercessory prayers of a particular figure do change God's mind. They get God to act in a way different than God was going to. So I would never discount the possibility of that. I just don't know. Bob?
Following that question, then, what would be your definition of heaven? Is there a
Well, that gets us into, yes, because that question packed a lot into it in a short time. There's the idea of prayer and God's grace, and then the idea of heaven. Okay? And again, I can't tell you I know what heaven is. For sure, it's like the unknowable, aspect of God, ultimately. Don't know what it is. Never met anybody who'd been there. Okay? It is one of those things that we have tried to make sense of from the very beginning in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And there has never been, it's just like when we talked about resurrection, there's never been a single understanding of what exactly resurrection is, either in the Bible or in Christian theology. The same holds for heaven. There's never been a single definition that has held true from beginning to end as to what heaven is. My own personal theological perspective is that when we die, we return to the God who made us. I do not know what that looks like or sounds like, but I do believe that we return to the God that made us. If that's heaven, I mean, some have called that a definition of heaven. I don't know, but that's my sense. Okay. Here's a different one. Thank God. Batman or Superman? Yes. Yes. I know the question was sent in fun from someone who I go back and forth with on this kind of thing a lot. But as I thought about it, I thought, you know what? There's something in that question. Okay? Because those two iconic characters have been seen as reflections of American society for a long time. And not just American society, but us individually. And so I say yes because, on the one hand, Superman is always considered sort of the symbol, the reflection of goodness and what's right, and those kinds of things. And I think that is a reflection of that part of us individually and as a society. That we have that Superman quality in some ways. But on the other hand, Batman has always tended to be more of a reflection of not our bad side, because he's regularly working at least for what is supposed to be just, but from a little darker side of it, in ways that maybe aren't necessarily always the most moral or ethical. And so, I look at the two of them as sort of, you put them together as a reflection of us individually and as a society, as a culture, and humanity in general, that we have these different aspects of ourselves, and we're trying to get to what is right. And sometimes it's not as simple as sort of Superman's, this is this, and I'm going to go do this and fix this. Sometimes it's more complicated, like the way things usually are for Batman when he is engaged in the things that he does. So Batman or Superman? Yes. Bruce? Is there a reading assignment about Batman and Superman? No. No. No, there is not. Yeah, Frank? Okay, so Frank's asking about King David, and we've mentioned this before during messages when David's been a part of it. Outside of Jesus, David might be my most favorite character in the Bible. Because on the one hand, David does these wonderful things throughout his life. And at the same time, throughout his life, David does some absolutely abhorrent things. And I appreciate the fact that someone who is such a prominent character in the Bible, and there's no more prominent character in the Hebrew Scriptures than David. I appreciate the fact that someone who is that prominent in our sacred texts is so complicated and so very human. Okay? And I certainly think that is intentional on the part of the writers. And then there is this aspect. At the same time, we are often told that one of the reasons that David is favored by God is that David always had, the phrase is, a heart for God. And you look at that and you think, well, wait a minute. Is that the same guy that did all that awful stuff? That guy had a heart for God? And I think there's a lot to be taken from that. Because it says to us that we can have a heart for God and not get it all right. And sometimes do some awful stuff. And still have a heart for God. Want to fulfill becoming all that God has created us to be. Yeah. Yeah, that's how I feel about it too. I mean, it gives me hope that maybe I'm not lost for good, because I haven't murdered anyone that I know of. So, and David did a little bit of that, right? Okay, we're getting down to the end here. Let's see. How about this one? So often following a tragedy such as the Texas flood, you hear leaders say, "We are sending our thoughts and prayers to those affected." If the statements are sincere, do they constitute prayer? Yeah, I think so. I think if the statements are sincere, that they definitely constitute prayer. I mean, prayer can be expressed in many ways. It isn't just, reciting the Lord's Prayer or things like that. I mean, prayer can simply be sitting in a room and thinking about others who you would like God's blessings upon or God's assistance for. That kind of intercessory prayer, as we talked about with one of the other questions. So yeah, if it's sincere, I think that it is prayer. At the same time, however, that's all well and good, but at the same time, I believe that our leaders, our political, religious, civic, our leaders have a responsibility to not just offer prayers. They have a responsibility to also help alleviate the suffering that has been caused, and also, I think more importantly, do whatever is necessary to prevent that suffering from occurring again. So I think it's always sort of a both and in our spiritual tradition. That prayer is good, but prayer alone is not sufficient, because we know there are several places in the Bible where God will say to the Israelites, or Jesus will remind his followers, that our worship and our sacrifices and our prayers are not all that God is looking for. And sometimes in the Hebrew scriptures, there are times when God says, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your prayers. I want you to do justice, love mercy, and act with kindness. So it's always a both and. Yes, I think the prayers, if it's sincere, it's definitely prayer. But if we're talking about leaders, there also comes a responsibility to not just pray, but to help alleviate and prevent the suffering. Okay. Last one, if you have one. If not, we go on. Oh, okay, then 2. That's all right, we'll do both, Judy and Chet, and then we'll go to communion. Oh, Judy is reminding me, hoping that I was aware that your thoughts and prayers were with me over the last couple of months, and asking how I am. Well, yes, I was well aware of that. I hope they continue because it's going to be a few more months before full recovery. I'm doing okay. Yeah, not great, but okay. Well enough to be with you. So, which I wanted to get back to as quickly as possible.
Are you walking the dog?
Am I walking? No. Nope. Only if it's an emergency. Okay, Cindy had to go away on a work trip for 8 days recently, so I had to do it a little bit. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I see the surgeon this Friday, so we'll know where things are at. So, Chat.
Do psychics have a place in the church?
Do psychics have a place in the church? I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Psychics talk to the spirit,
Yeah.
talk to relatives, talk to bring mediums into one's life.
Yeah, but when you say, do they have a place in the church, I'm not sure I get that part of it. Is it okay for them to be? I don't know what you mean by, do they have a place in the church?
Should they be accepted by the church?
Sure. Why not? Especially with us, if we mean the idea that all are welcome, then all means all. If a person happens to be a psychic, that's their thing. But if they come into this community with the understanding, of wanting to be part of a Christian community, wanting to be disciples of Jesus, and live that out, those are two different things to me. Okay? I mean, again, the idea of, whether someone is a psychic and is that valid, I don't know. I don't know for sure. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much once again. We do this about 6 times a year, so our next one will be sometime in the fall.